The night everything really started, my house looked like a snow globe someone had shaken a little too hard. 10,000 bulbs wrapped the palms in front of our place, ran along the roofline, and spilled into arches over the driveway. The lawn shimmered with color, the reflection rippling in the dark canal behind the cul-de-sac. The humid Florida air clung to my skin like a warm blanket as I stood at the end of the driveway, admiring the glow and the faint buzz of all that electricity humming in the background. At the curb, a white SUV crawled past with its hazard lights on. On the door, the association logo shone under the street lamp, a little lighthouse icon in muted blue. The SUV slowed to a stop directly in front of my property line, and I could almost feel the judgment rolling off it, thick and invisible. I told myself this was just some routine patrol, that at worst I might get a friendly reminder about turning the lights off by 10. I had no idea that this night would turn into the kind of HOA revenge story people trade in whispers at block parties. In the passenger seat, I saw her. Perfect blowout, rigid posture, a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Her name was Marla, and on paper she was the president of our homeowners association. In reality, she was the self-appointed guardian of community standards, the one who treated the bylaws like sacred scripture. She tilted her head to take in the arches of lights over my driveway, the synchronized reindeer on the lawn, the giant star pulsing above the garage. It felt like she was cataloging every single bulb. The SUV idled there for a long beat, engine barely audible under the distant whir of someone's pool pump. Then a phone appeared in her hand. I watched her hold it up, framing my house, pausing, then shifting to catch the side yard where a tunnel of light led toward the backyard dock. No wave, no nod, no attempt at human warmth. Just evidence gathering. Documentation. The kind of thing that meant a file with my name on it was already forming in some committee folder. I remember thinking that the worst that could happen was a stern letter or maybe a small fine. I was proud of what I had built, proud enough to shrug off a little disapproval. I had spent weeks mapping out the channels, bundling cords, and tracking down the good LEDs on sale. This was our first Christmas in the neighborhood, and after the last few chaotic years, I wanted something joyful that people could drive by and smile at. I never imagined that a single over-the-top display and a future petition of my neighbors would end up deciding who actually ran this community, the board, or the people who lived under it. Because before this fight was over, Marla would find herself cornered by the very rules she clung to. And the woman who tried to play Scrooge with my lights would be forced to watch the entire street light up around her in a way she could never control. To really understand how we got there, you have to understand where I live. Our neighborhood sits just outside a busy Florida highway, but once you pass through the gate, it feels like a different world. The entrance has stone columns and a security arm that ticks up only after a little green light flashes on the keypad. Palms line the main boulevard, and every cul-de-sac curls off it like a polished little culvert of identical dreams. From the brochure, you'd think it was paradise: manicured lawns, tidy sidewalks, a sparkling community pool, and a low-maintenance lifestyle. That low-maintenance lifestyle came with a catch: the homeowners association. When my partner and I closed on the house earlier that year, the title company handed us a thick binder along with the keys. The cover read Cypress Shore Residential Community, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Inside were pages of dense text, numbered sections, and rules about everything from fence height to acceptable mailbox finishes. Tucked into that binder was a printed page highlighted in yellow: CCR Section 4.3 Seasonal Exterior Displays. I barely glanced at it at the time, more focused on paint swatches and where our furniture would go. Over the summer, I got to know the association more through its letters than through its people. There was the note about leaving my trash can visible from the street for more than 24 hours after pickup. Another about parking our extra car at the curb overnight. I received an email reminder about pressure washing the driveway 1 month earlier than I planned. None of it was catastrophic, but it painted a clear picture. Someone on that board watched everything, and they liked the feeling of control it gave them. Marla's name showed up again and again. She signed the emails as President, Cypress Shore HOA, and there was always a tone underneath the polite phrasing, like she was doing us a favor by keeping the neighborhood from sliding into chaos. At the first community meeting I attended, she stood at the front of the clubhouse with a binder and a laser pointer, clicking through slides about landscaping compliance and preserving aesthetic harmony. People nodded along, more from habit than enthusiasm. That night, I also learned about the the Architectural Review Committee. They were the ones who approved any changes to your property that could be seen from the street. Paint color, fencing, pergolas, even certain types of garden decor. Marla chaired that committee, too. She was the one who announced, with a hint of pride, that they had recently denied a request for a front yard fountain because it was too whimsical for the architectural vision. It became clear that in Cypress Shore, whimsy was a threat. And, unfortunately for Marla, I have a high tolerance for whimsy when it comes to holidays. In October, the first clash came in small form. I set a couple of decorative pumpkins on the front steps and a tasteful metal lantern next to the door. The next week, I opened my mailbox to find a courtesy reminder from the association. It referenced CCR Section 2.7.1, which I had never heard of, stating that seasonal decor should be subtle and aligned with the community's aesthetic. The letter mentioned concerns raised about the cluttered appearance of my entryway and suggested I limit my decor to one item. There was no fine attached, just a firm suggestion wrapped in fake friendliness. I rolled my eyes and brought one pumpkin inside to make whoever complained feel like they had won. The thing about petty people in power, though, is that small victories only fuel bigger ambitions. That courtesy reminder was a warning shot, a test to see whether I would fall in line. Just before Thanksgiving, we got the annual, seasonal decoration reminder email. It laid out the official rules for holiday lighting: no decorations before December 1st, no music, only white lights on the front elevation, nothing inflating, nothing taller than 4 feet, lights off by 10 p.m. sharp. It also reminded residents that all exterior changes had to comply with CCR Section 4.3.1 Holiday Display Rule, which allowed the board to demand removal of any decor deemed excessive, distracting, or inharmonious with the community aesthetic. I remember reading that phrase and feeling a little chill, like it was written specifically for someone like Marla to wield. I still might have played it safe if not for one thing. This was our first year in a house that actually felt like ours. I grew up in apartments where we taped paper snowflakes to windows and twisted cheap plastic garlands along balcony rails. I always dreamed of being the house people drove by to see, the one that made kids gasp and parents slow down. When we bought this place, I told myself that when the holidays came, I would make our yard look like a festival. So, while the reminder sat in my inbox, I started buying lights. I picked up strands at big box stores and online sales. I found a used controller system in a local listing and spent evenings on the floor, sprawled out with zip ties and extension cord maps. I watched tutorials about how to layer colors and how to make light tunnels over the driveway. The more I planned, the more excited I got. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, I had more boxes of lights in the garage than I had room for in the attic. My partner warned me that the board might not be thrilled. But even they laughed when I walked them through my design, waving my hands in the air as I described how the house would glow. They reminded me that we did, technically, live under a set of rules that didn't love individuality, much less a small electric carnival. I told myself I would find a balance. Of course, my version of balance and Marla's version of balance were never going to match. And as I opened that first box of lights and pulled out the tangled strands, I had no clue that this display would split the neighborhood into quiet factions and push the board into a corner it couldn't quietly back out of. I started putting the lights up the weekend after Thanksgiving. Technically, it was a few days before December 1st, but the weather forecast showed rain later in the week, and Florida rain can turn a perfectly good extension cord into an instant regret. The sky was a flat gray that morning, with a thin layer of clouds stretching over the canal. I dragged the ladder out, set on wrapping the palms with careful spirals so they would look like glowing trunks once night fell. As I worked, people passed by. A jogger in a neon tank gave a thumbs up. A couple in a golf cart slowed to watch as I tested a strand and the lights flickered to life along the front eaves. Some kids on bikes stopped at the curb, fascinated by the boxes stacked near the garage. Their faces lit up when they saw the giant star I had bought for the roof peak. They asked questions about what it would look like, and while I didn't quote them back, their excitement fed into my own determination. By the time evening rolled in, the front of the house was wrapped in color. Blue and white along the roofline, warm white on the columns, and a scattering of red and green across the bushes. The palm trunks glowed with tight, shimmering spirals, and the driveway arches formed a tunnel of light. Standing on the sidewalk, I could see how the whole display framed the house, bright but not chaotic, at least in my eyes. It felt festive, like the neighborhood finally exhaled after months of the same beige and white. That first night, I kept the lights on for less than an hour. Just enough to test the connections, make sure nothing tripped the breakers, and tweak the placement on a couple of strands. As I walked back up the driveway, I noticed a silver sedan parked further down the cul-de-sac. It sat there with its headlights off, just idling. The silhouette inside was hard to make out, but I didn't need a close-up to guess who might be watching. The next morning, I found the first note. It wasn't in my mailbox, which would have made it official. It was taped to my front door, tucked into the narrow window frame so it wouldn't blow away. The association letterhead sat at the top, and beneath it, a bold subject line, courtesy notice, unapproved exterior display. It referenced CCR Section 4.3 Holiday Display Rule and mentioned that decorative lighting visible from the street has been observed prior to the permitted installation date of December 1st. It urged me to align my schedule with community guidelines and avoid further action. The language was polite, but the message was clear: they were watching. I folded the letter and slid it into the binder with the other notices, a habit I had formed after that trash can reminder. Something about having a paper trail gave me comfort, like if this ever escalated, I would have proof that I wasn't imagining the pressure. I told myself that this was no big deal, that starting a few days early wasn't a crime. December 1st was only around the corner, and I had not yet turned the show on for real. Besides, several other houses in the neighborhood had simple white lights already up on their eaves, and no one seemed to be taping notes to their doors. Still, the wording of the notice, and the way it referenced that specific rule, made the hair on my neck lift. As the days passed, I finished the build. I installed a low, glowing fence line of lights along the front hedges. I mounted the giant star at the top of the roof and ran the power cords back to the controller. I added a row of small lit trees down the side yard, guiding the eye toward the dock, where another string of lights traced the railing. When everything was finally in place, I ran the test sequence and watched as the entire property pulsed in waves. It felt like I had turned my little patch of Florida into a celebration. Around this time, I started hearing stories from neighbors who had been in the community longer than I had. They talked about the time the board fined someone for hanging wind chimes that were audible from the sidewalk. Another neighbor mentioned that an earlier resident once had to remove a small garden gnome because it was considered out of character with the architectural style. Listening to them, I realized that Marla's control had been building for years, and most people had just decided it was easier to shrink their personalities than to push back. I remember thinking that if this was a Karen neighbor drama, I had walked in at the beginning of the third act. The only difference was that this time, the person being pushed would not be going quietly. The first official violation notice arrived a few days later. Unlike the courtesy reminder, this one came by mail in a crisp white envelope, with an account number printed in the corner. The letter stated that my property was in violation of CCR Section 4.3.1 and Section 4.3.24, installation of multicolored lights visible from common areas, and decorations likely to distract drivers. It noted that I had until December 10th to correct the violation by removing non-compliant decor or bringing it into alignment with approved aesthetics. If I failed to comply, the association reserved the right to impose fines and schedule a compliance hearing. At the bottom, the letter mentioned one more thing: future penalties may be assessed at a rate of $50 per day until the violation is resolved. The date on the letter was December 1st. The countdown had officially started. 10 days. 10 days to either tear down a display I had poured my time, money, and heart into, or stand my ground and risk daily fines piling up against me. 10 days to decide whether this community would be a place where one committee controlled our sense of home, or whether the people who lived behind these carefully pruned hedges still had any autonomy left. That deadline was the board's attempt to squeeze me quietly into submission, but they underestimated how much of my identity was wrapped up in every single light on that roof. I slid the violation notice into my growing folder of papers, right after the printed copy of CCR Section 4.3 I had finally taken time to read. The rules were broad, vague in all the ways that gave the association power. They used words like inappropriate, excessive, and inconsistent with community standards without ever defining what those standards really were. Looking at the stack of letters, it hit me that this wasn't just about lights. This was about who got to decide what home looked like here. My partner asked what I was going to do. The simplest answer would have been to strip the house down to plain white Eve lights, turn everything off by 9:30 just to be safe, and hope the board moved on to some other target. But as I stood in the driveway that night, watching car after car slow down to take in the glow, I felt something shift. I saw neighbors lingering longer, kids laughing, people taking photos. This wasn't just my project anymore. The display had become something the street shared. That realization planted a new idea. If the board wanted to frame this fight as one homeowner versus the rules, I could change the picture. I could turn it into a question of the community's voice versus a small group's control. The violation notice had a deadline for me, but it also gave me a fixed point to plan around. 10 days until fines. 10 days until the light show either got dimmed down, or turned all the way up with a lot more people backing it. And as the clock began to tick toward December 10th, I decided something quietly but firmly. If they were going to drag me into a war over Christmas lights, I was going to make sure the whole neighborhood saw exactly how that war was fought. The board wanted this to be a quiet little scolding, tucked away in a file with my lot number on it. I decided instead that every step they took would leave a visible footprint. If they were going to call this a violation, I would make sure everyone could see exactly how far they were willing to go to snuff out a little joy. That thought settled into my chest like a weight, but also like a kind of fuel. I started documenting everything. I took photos of my display from different angles, with and without traffic. I kept copies of every email and letter in a folder I labeled Holiday 4.3 in thick black marker. I printed the violation notice and slid it into a clear plastic sleeve, right behind a copy of CCR Section 4.3 with sections underlined in red. I wanted a record, not just for me, but for whatever might come later. Meanwhile, the community kept reacting. Every evening, as the sun went down and the air cooled from heavy to simply warm, I turned the lights on. Cars slowed. People rolled down their windows. I could see faces glow in the shifting colors, kids craning their necks from car seats to take it all in. Neighbors walking dogs paused at the edge of my yard longer each night. Some gave quick nods or small smiles as they passed, their expressions saying what their words did not, they liked it. The board's presence was harder to miss now. A golf cart with the association logo did slow circuits through the cul-de-sac. Sometimes it stopped at the corner, the driver making notes on a clipboard. On one evening, as I turned off the lights right at 10 p.m., I saw the cart parked at the other end of the street, facing my house as if timing me. It felt less like a neighborhood watch and more like surveillance. Still, I tried not to flinch. I made sure my cords were tidy, connections protected, timers set. I kept the sidewalk clear, double-checked that nothing blocked the street. If they were going after me, it would not be for any genuine safety concern. They would have to lean on vague phrases and personal taste, and I planned to make that obvious. Around December 4th, a new email hit everyone's inbox. The subject line was generic, something about holiday safety and compliance. In the body, the association reminded residents to keep decorations minimal and unified, and warned about a particular property whose decor has generated concerns. They never named my address, but they did not have to. Anyone who had driven through our cul-de-sac in the last week knew exactly who they meant. The email referenced CCR Section 4.3 again and mentioned that the Architectural Review Committee had begun active monitoring of holiday displays. Reading that phrase, I pictured Marla with her binder, walking the neighborhood with the satisfaction of someone who had found a new project. The email ended with a line about appreciating the efforts of those who prioritize harmony over excess. It was a compliment that felt like a slap. That night, as I switched on the display, I realized something important. This was no longer just a private annoyance. The board had turned my house into an example, a warning to everyone else about what happens when you color too far outside their lines. It was control disguised as safety. That realization pushed me past the line between annoyance and intention. I decided I would not only keep the lights up. I would push this into the open, where it would be harder for the board to hide behind generic notices and vague phrases. If they wanted to make me the center of their seasonal enforcement, I would make the conversation bigger than me. Days ticked by, the December 10th deadline hovered. I watched the calendar like a countdown clock, each morning a reminder that I was inching closer to either tearing down months of planning or stepping into a deeper confrontation. I thought about what it meant to live under an association rather than in a community. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many people here had probably swallowed their anger over smaller things just to keep the peace. What if, just this once, someone didn't swallow it? The real escalation arrived in my mailbox on a sunny afternoon when the air shimmered over the pavement and the cicadas screeched from the palms. I pulled out a stiff envelope stamped with a small green label, Time-Sensitive Association Correspondence. My stomach tightened even before I flipped it over. Inside was a thicker letter than before, this one with bold headings and all-caps warnings. The top line read, Final Notice, Holiday Display Non-Compliance. The date at the corner was December 8th. It referenced my previous violation notice and stated that my property remained out of alignment with community standards due to the multicolored lights, the driveway arches, and the illuminated trees in the side yard. The letter declared that if I did not remedy the violation by December 10th, daily fines of $50 would begin on December 11th. It did not stop there. Halfway down the page, a new paragraph outlined a scheduled compliance hearing. According to the letter, I was hereby notified of a hearing to be held on December 14th at 7 p.m. at the clubhouse, where the board would review ongoing violations on Lot 27 and consider further action, including enhanced fines and potential legal remedies under CCR Section 9.1 enforcement. My lot number at the end of that line felt like a target painted in black ink. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me, the hum of the air conditioner barely cutting the tight silence. The phrase, potential legal remedies, sat heavy in my mind. I knew enough to understand that fines could become liens, that liens could create problems for our mortgage, and that this was not just about a few $100s. I placed the final notice dated December 8th into my binder, right after the first violation letter, and snapped the rings closed more firmly than I needed to. This was an evidence prop now, not just a threat. The math was ugly. If I left the lights up through the season and the association pushed the fines to the maximum they hinted at, we could be staring down well over $1,000 in penalties, maybe more if they tried to add fees or administrative costs. For most people in the neighborhood, that kind of money was enough to hurt, even if it did not completely wreck them. For us, it meant dipping into savings we had built slowly, month by month. The board wanted that fear. They wanted the calculation to be simple, decor versus dollars. A little joy versus your financial safety. They assumed that once the money was on the line, I would fold. Instead, that pressure made something else sharper in my mind. It highlighted just how deeply this association relied on people being too scared or too isolated to push back. If they wanted to weaponize money, I would weaponize something they had taken for granted, the collective voice of the neighbors they thought were meek. I knew I needed to understand the rules they were leaning on even better. That night, I sat at the dining table with the CCR binder open, flipping past the holiday section and into the back where the governance rules lived. I found sections about member rights, about meetings, about how the board was supposed to operate. One paragraph in particular caught my eye. It said that if a certain percentage of homeowners signed a petition, they could demand that the board address a specific issue or call a special meeting. The language was dense, but the idea was simple. The association structure assumed that the board answered, at least in theory, to the people who paid the dues. If enough of those people spoke up at once, the board could not simply pretend they were dealing with one problem owner. They had to listen, or at least sit in a room and have their decisions questioned in front of others. That thought clicked into place with everything I had been watching on our street. The smiling families, the neighbors who lingered in front of the lights, the quick nods from folks who had their own stories of petty enforcement. The board may have had the power to levy fines, but they did not have the power to stop people from signing their names on paper. The petition idea started as a scribble on a notepad. I wrote a simple statement about supporting seasonal displays that brought joy to the community, about asking the board to suspend enforcement of CCR Section 4.3 for the remainder of the season and to review it at a future meeting. I added a line about fairness, about how rules should not be enforced selectively. At the bottom, I left space for names, lot numbers, and signatures. The next day, I printed off a stack of copies. I tucked them into a folder and walked down the street, the sun heavy and bright on the sidewalks. My heart pounded harder than it should have for what was, technically, just knocking on doors and talking to neighbors. But I knew this was the first real step from quiet frustration into open resistance. I quickly learned that my house was not the only one with a file in Marla's binder. At one door, a neighbor told me about the time the board threatened fines over a small set of patio chairs visible from the street. At another, someone mentioned an argument over the shade of beige they had chosen for their front door. People had stories ready, they had just never been given a place to stack them together. Many of them signed the petition without hesitation. Some hesitated, glancing down the street as if the association might be watching even this. I never pressured anyone. I simply explained that all I wanted was for the board to pause the punishment and sit down with us to talk about what kind of community we actually wanted to live in. The more doors I knocked on, the more confident I became that this was not just an isolated, decor dispute, no matter how much the board tried to frame it as one. By the end of the weekend, my petition sheets were speckled with ink. Names, lot numbers, signatures from people I had only waved to before now felt like a quiet chorus. The board had scheduled its hearing for December 14th, but now I was planning something else around that date, a moment where they would have to look out at the faces of the people they thought would always defer to them. As I slid the stack of signed petitions into a plastic sleeve and added it behind the final notice dated December 8th, my binder began to feel less like a stack of threats and more like a case file. I was not trying to break the association. I just wanted to show them what they looked like when they pushed ordinary people too far. The escalation did not stop with the final notice. A few days before the hearing, someone forwarded me a document they had received from a friend who volunteered at the clubhouse, the draft of the board agenda for December 14th. There, under New Business, was a line that read, Holiday Compliance Hearings, Lot 27, Ongoing Violation of CCR Section 4.3. It was a small line on a typed page, but it felt like seeing my name on a marquee I never auditioned for. I printed the agenda excerpt and added it to my binder as another piece of proof. The board wanted a show, I was going to give them one, though not the one they thought they were headlining. By the time the hearing date circled closer, the situation was clear. The board had moved from quiet reminders to a final notice dated December 8th, set daily fines to start on December 11th, and slotted my lot onto their December 14th agenda, while I had turned my front yard into a symbol, collected a thick stack of neighbor signatures, and begun building a case that this was not just one person defying the rules but an entire street questioning who those rules really served. With the hearing looming, I knew I had to decide how far I was willing to push. Backing down now would make the fines vanish faster, but it would also tell the board that the threat had worked. Pushing forward meant risk, but it also meant the chance to show everyone what could happen when someone refused to quietly swallow the bullying hidden inside polite association letterhead. The evening before the hearing, the sky turned that soft bruised purple that sometimes settles over the canals, and the air felt cooler than usual as a faint breeze moved the palms. By now, the petition had grown thicker than I expected. People from other sections of the neighborhood had reached out after hearing about it, some asking to sign, some just thanking me for pushing back. I received a couple of polite notes in my mailbox from residents who wanted to stay anonymous but supported what I was doing. Every name felt like another strand of lights added to the display, something that made the whole thing glow a little brighter. I had options now. I could bring the petitions to the hearing, stand there alone in front of the board table, and read a statement while they stared back in polite impatience. I could email them ahead of time, turning the confrontation into a paper exchange instead of a face-to-face showdown. Or I could choose a third path, bring the community into the room, not just on paper, but in presence. That third option appealed to me in a way that surprised even myself. The board loved closed doors and formal letters. I wanted open space and witnesses. I wanted the room at the clubhouse to feel what I felt every time I walked past their notices, that some decisions were not just administrative, but personal. So I started planning what came next. I sent quiet messages to the neighbors who had been the most vocal. I told them when the hearing was scheduled and mentioned that hearings were, in theory, open for other residents to attend. I suggested, gently, that it might send a message if the seats in the clubhouse were not empty when the board called Lot 27 onto the agenda. I also decided that if they were going to accuse my display of being excessive, I would lean into something else instead: symbolism. I bought a single new box of lights, not to make the yard brighter, but to add one more feature to the display. I wrapped them around the trunk of the small oak near the sidewalk, the same tree that had shaded my mailbox from summer heat. I chose a single color for that tree, one that matched the association's little lighthouse logo, and set it to glow steadily. It was my small, quiet reminder that the board did not own that color, that symbol, or our sense of what this place could be. As I added those lights, the neighborhood felt different. People waved more. A few stopped to ask how the situation was going, their voices low but their eyes sharp. The story had spread beyond our cul-de-sac. This was no longer just about my yard, it was about whether a pattern everyone had quietly tolerated was finally being dragged into the light. What I was planning next was not about fines or legal language. It was about embarrassment, about showing the board that the people they had treated like background figures had faces, voices, and the power to make them squirm. If this association's leadership thrived on controlling the narrative from behind tidy agendas and stiff notices, then my quiet goal was simple: I wanted them to look out from that table and feel the heat of their own neighbors' eyes. The thought of it made my pulse race. I pictured Marla sitting at the center of that table in the clubhouse, flanked by the treasurer and the secretary, their binders lined up like a shield. I imagined her starting the holiday compliance hearings section of the agenda and then falling into a brief, involuntary pause when she realized half the chairs in the room were filled. Not by troublemakers from outside, but by the very people who were supposed to accept her decisions without question. I did not plan to shout, to bang on tables, or to turn the hearing into chaos. That would only feed the board's narrative about disruptive owners. Instead, I wanted a quiet, undeniable display, a packed room, a stack of petitions, and a set of questions that forced the board to say out loud what kind of community they thought they were protecting when they tried to dim one house out of many. As I walked back into my house that night, leaving the lights humming gently outside, I set my binder on the counter. Inside it, the story was already written in documents: the first courtesy reminder, the violation notice, the final notice dated December 8, the agenda excerpt, and the petition pages signed by dozens of neighbors. All that remained was to turn those papers into a moment the board could not quietly file away. Tomorrow, we would go to the clubhouse. Tomorrow, the board would look out and see more than just one non-compliant owner. They would see the crowd they had created by insisting on being the only voice that mattered. And whether they backed down or dug in, they would not walk away from that table without feeling, for once, what it was like to be held accountable by the very people they were so sure would always stay silent. The morning of the hearing felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The sky was a flat blue dome, the kind that looks calm but hides heat like an oven door. I woke up early, even though the meeting wasn't until the evening, and laid everything out on the kitchen table. The binder sat in the center, thick with plastic sleeves and sharp corners. Beside it, I placed the stack of petitions, each page weighted with the ink of signatures that now felt like shared courage. The final notice dated December 8 Saturday near the front of the binder, followed by the violation notice, the printout of CCR Section 4.3, and the agenda excerpt that had my lot number sitting under Holiday Compliance Hearings. Behind those, the petition pages waited, each name like a small spark. I slipped them all into one large sleeve and closed the rings, hearing the click echo a little more than usual in the quiet kitchen. The day crawled. I tried to do normal things: answer emails, water the plants, tidy up the living room. But my eyes kept drifting to the clock and then to the front windows, where I could see fragments of the display even under the bright afternoon sun. The arches stood as pale outlines, cords tucked neatly along the edges. The star on the roof looked almost modest without the darkness to frame it. As the sun dipped and the sky turned shades of gold and pink over the canal, I turned the lights on one more time before leaving. The glow washed across the lawn, reflected faintly in the windows of the houses opposite ours. It felt like a quiet promise, a reminder to myself that this was the hill I'd chosen to stand on, and I was not standing there alone. Neighbors started emerging as we got ready to head to the clubhouse. Some waved, some nodded, some said they would see us there, in that careful, coded way that meant they were coming but did not want it broadcast. Watching them gather, I realized how rarely the people who live under these kinds of rules actually showed up for each other in the same room, at the same time. Maybe that was exactly why the board had always seemed so untouchable. We drove to the clubhouse in a small cluster of cars. The parking lot was more crowded than usual for a weeknight meeting. The yellow glow from the lobby spilled out onto the sidewalk, and as we walked up, I could hear the muffled murmur of voices already inside. My heart hammered in my chest, but it wasn't fear this time. It was anticipation. Inside, the clubhouse meeting room looked like every association meeting room I had ever seen: neutral paint, framed prints of generic landscapes, a long table at the front where the board sat in a row. The fluorescent lights hummed gently overhead, casting a flat brightness that made every expression easy to read. Marla sat in the middle position, a binder in front of her, a neat stack of papers aligned with the edge of the table. The treasurer and secretary flanked her, both with folders and pens ready. Only this time, the chairs facing them were not mostly empty. Row after row was filled with familiar faces from my street and beyond it. People leaned back with crossed arms or sat forward on the edge of their seats. Some clutched printed copies of the holiday reminder email. A few held their phones, screens dark but ready. The quiet in the room had a different flavor than usual. It wasn't boredom. It was focus. I realized in that moment that this was bigger than fines or even my display. If the board chose to push ahead and punish me in front of this many witnesses, they would be doing it in a way that could finally backfire on them beyond a single property. If they doubled down tonight, they weren't just risking money or a little embarrassment. They were risking the kind of challenge that could end with them losing control of the very seats they were sitting in, through election rules that were written long before this homeowners association drama ever started. The meeting started with the usual formalities. Approval of prior minutes, a quick treasurer's report about dues, a reminder about pool maintenance. My mind drifted through those segments, but I watched everyone else instead. People fidgeted, glanced toward the agenda printed on a projection screen. At the bottom of the new business section, there it was: holiday compliance hearings, lot 27. When they finally reached that line, the room seemed to tighten. Marla cleared her throat and announced that the board would be reviewing a holiday display violation concerning lot 27. She described it in broad terms: excessive lighting, non-compliance with CCR Section 4.3, potential safety concerns. She mentioned the final notice dated December 8 and the commencement of daily fines. Then she invited me to address the board about the matter. I stood up, feeling every pair of eyes track me as I carried my binder to the small stand in front of the board table. I did not raise my voice. I did not wave my arms. I simply opened the binder, laid out the documents one by one, and began to tell the story the way the paper trail had captured it. The courtesy note, the first violation notice, the final notice. I talked about the vague language, the selective enforcement, the neighbors whose simple decor had never drawn a single letter, and the way my display had been singled out as distracting without a single documented incident. The room was too bright, the air-conditioned chill mixing with a faint smell of coffee from a side table where someone had set up a small refreshment station. I used that brightness to my advantage. I held up the final notice dated December 8 so the audience could see the bold type and the line about $50 per day fines. I held up the CCR Section 4.3 pages and pointed out the phrases like excessive and inappropriate that had no clear definition. Then I slid the petitions out of the binder and laid them on the stand. Page after page of signatures caught the light. I explained that these were from residents who supported seasonal displays that brought joy to the community, who believed enforcement should be consistent and not driven by personal taste, and who requested that the board suspend holiday fines and revisit CCR Section 4.3 before the next season. I did not accuse anyone of malice. Instead, I talked about perception. I said that when neighbors see one house targeted with escalating fines while other displays go untouched, it does not feel like preserving harmony. It feels like control. It feels like one set of personal preferences being enforced as law. I mentioned the wind chimes, the garden gnome, the patio chairs that people had told me about, not to relitigate old issues but to show a pattern of strictness that had left people anxious about expressing themselves at all. As I spoke, I noticed little things. The treasurer's pen stopped moving. The secretary's lips tightened slightly. And, for the first time since I had met her, Marla's expression faltered. Her composure was still there, but cracks appeared, a small frown, a glance at the audience that lingered too long, a quick breath drawn through her nose. When I finished, I did not grandstand. I simply asked the board to consider what kind of neighborhood we wanted to be. One where people whispered about fines and rules, or one where the association worked with owners instead of against them when it came to something as simple as holiday lights. I asked them to pause the fines, review the rule in an open forum, and stop using vague language as a tool for intimidation. Then I stepped back and returned to my seat. The quiet that followed was almost heavier than if people had clapped. The board retreated into a brief discussion. They spoke in low voices, passing documents back and forth. They referenced the CCR's enforcement section, the prior letters, the precedent they thought they had to maintain. They glanced at the room more than once, as if expecting someone to suddenly stand and cause a scene. But no one did. Everyone simply watched. Finally, they called the meeting back to order and announced their decision. They would temporarily suspend the daily fines against Lot 27 for the remainder of the holiday season. They would consider revisions to CCR Section 4.3 in light of community feedback and place it on the agenda for the next general membership meeting. They also agreed, out loud, that holiday displays would not be escalated to legal action absent clear safety issues. The words were measured, but the meaning was clear. They had backed down. They had tried to frame it as a neutral compromise, but suspending fines and agreeing to revisit the very rule they had used as a weapon was a retreat. One they were making in a room full of witnesses. The reaction from the crowd was subtle but powerful. There were small nods, a few exhaled breaths, a quiet shift in posture as people relaxed into their chairs. No one cheered. No one needed to. The message had already landed, the board could be challenged, and if enough people stood together, the board blinked. I knew, though, that this was only the first half of the revenge. Suspending fines was a victory, but the structure that allowed those fines to appear so easily was still in place. The real change would come later, when the annual meeting rolled around and those signatures turned from a petition into something more permanent, votes. Because buried in the governance section of the CCR, there was a quiet clause that mattered more than any holiday rule. It said that board members served at the pleasure of the homeowners, and that elections were decided by those who showed up and cast their ballots. The board had always counted on apathy to keep the same faces in the same chairs. Now, after the way they had tried to turn one festive house into a cautionary tale, they had unintentionally created something they feared more than any single violation, a motivated electorate. In the weeks that followed, the holidays unfolded in a different light. My display stayed up. The lights turned on each evening, glow spilling across the yard and reflecting in the canal. Cars still slowed. Neighbors still strolled by. Only now, some of them carried a new and quiet energy when they waved. They had watched their signatures carry weight. They had seen the board soften in the face of a roomful of their own neighbors. The daily fine threat never resumed. Instead, the board sent out a neutral-sounding email to everyone summarizing recent feedback about holiday decor and promising a comprehensive review of CCR Section 4.3 at the next membership meeting. The email did not mention my address or the hearing by name, but anyone who had been there understood the translation. We coasted through the end of December with the lights shining. On New Year's Eve, as the clock neared midnight, the arches over my driveway shimmered, the star pulsed, and the small oak wrapped in the association's logo color glowed steadily at the edge of the sidewalk. Fireworks popped faintly in the distance from somewhere beyond the gates. For the first time since the notices started, I felt like I could enjoy the display without a knot of anxiety in my chest. But I was not done. The binder on my shelf had grown thicker again, this time with the hearing notice, my own written remarks, and later, the official hearing minutes, December 14th, which the association was required to produce. In those minutes, in simple, dry text, the board had recorded their decision to suspend fines and revisit the rule. They had written their retreat into the record. That was something I wanted to keep. As January approached, talk about the annual meeting began. Normally, it was a sleepy affair. Ballots mailed in, a handful of people showing up, incumbents re-elected by default. This time, it was different. People who had never bothered to attend before suddenly cared. They asked questions in the community email thread about how many positions were open, how nominations worked, and what it meant to run for a seat. Quietly, a couple of my neighbors decided to step forward. One from my street, who had signed the petition early, agreed to run for a director's seat. Another resident from the opposite side of the community, who had once been told their patio umbrella was too bold, put their name in as well. They did not campaign with posters or loud speeches. They simply talked to the people they saw at the mailbox, at the pool, on walks, telling them they wanted a board that focused more on genuine issues and less on policing harmless joys. When the night of the annual meeting arrived, the clubhouse was crowded again. The weather outside was cooler now, a mild Florida winter evening with a soft breeze rustling the palms. Inside, the same fluorescent lights buzzed as ballots were counted. Marla sat at the front table, composed but visibly tense. She had no reason to assume people would vote her out, she had been in that seat for years. But this time, the room looked different. The association attorney read out the results. Again, there was no shouting, no theatrical moment. Just numbers. Enough votes had gone to the new candidates that the balance of the board shifted. Marla did not lose her place on the board entirely, but she did lose her presidency. The title shifted to someone else, someone who had promised to make enforcement more balanced and transparent. The look on her face at that moment was the real climax. This was the woman who had treated CCR Section 4.3 like a personal tool, who had driven around snapping photos of one house until she could justify daily fines. Now, in front of the same neighbors she had tried to intimidate, she was watching the role she had wrapped around herself like armor slip away. The room felt warmer than its air-conditioned chill as people shuffled their chairs and the new president thanked everyone for attending. Outside, the night air carried the faint smell of damp grass and nearby canal water. I stepped out into that air with my binder under my arm, feeling lighter than I had in months. The revenge had not been loud, and it had not been cruel. It had been measured, communal, and written into the very process the board had counted on to keep itself safe. In the months that followed, the tone of the association shifted. Not overnight and not in some fairy tale way, but noticeably. The new board sent out surveys asking residents what mattered most to them. They prioritized issues like drainage, security lighting at the entrances, and maintenance of the walking paths. They formed a small committee to review CCR Section 4.3 and invited volunteers, including me, to give input on holiday decor rules. When that committee met, the conversations were different from any I had expected. People talked about safety boundaries, but also about expression and joy. They suggested clear, objective limits instead of vague words, specific hours for lights, reasonable brightness standards, allowances for multicolored displays as long as they did not create hazards. We looked at other communities' written guidelines, not as weapons to copy, but as starting points to craft something that fit who we were. By the time the next holiday season arrived, CCR Section 4.3 had a new shape. Seasonal displays were allowed in more flexible form, with clearly defined quiet hours and a simple process for raising concerns that encouraged conversation before punishment. There were still rules, this was still an association. But there was also space for a street like mine to celebrate without living in fear of the next stiff white envelope. That December, my house lit up again. This time, though, it was not alone. The neighbor across from me added a line of glowing snowflakes along their fence. Another set up a gentle, color-changing tree in their yard. The cul-de-sac glowed softly as a collection instead of a single, defiant beacon. Kids walked between houses with wide eyes. Cars still slowed. Only now, the light felt shared rather than scrutinized. Sometimes, when I look back on that season, I think about how close I came to just giving in when the final notice dated December 8 hit my mailbox. Pay the fine, tear down the lights, keep the peace. It would have been easier in the short term. But we would have lost something important, the realization that we were not helpless under a clipboard and a logo. That when enough ordinary, quiet people decide a line has been crossed, they can push back hard enough to redraw it. I also think about Marla. She still lives in the neighborhood. I see her sometimes walking a small dog along the main boulevard. She nods politely when our paths cross. The sharp edge of her authority is gone now, dulled by a change in title and the memory of a room full of eyes watching as she backed down from a battle she chose and lost. In her own way, she's a reminder of what happens when power forgets who it is supposed to serve. It never really was about the bulbs themselves. It was about boundaries, where my home ended and the board's reach began, where shared standards turned into personal control. The lights were just the spark that made all of that visible, blazing bright enough that no one could pretend not to see anymore. Tell me your HOA war on Christmas lights horror in one line.